The next paper in this session is by Professor Laurent Zing, who is going to talk about the Hungarian legal solutions. Since 2018, our speaker has been a senior advisor at the Hungarian Constitutional Court. Previously, he worked in such important institutions as the Parliament, the President's Office, the Ministry of Administration and Justice, the Ombudsman's Office, and the Office of the Commissioner for Data Protection. He graduated from Caroline University of the Reformed Church in 2003. In 2008, he obtained his PhD, and in 2018, he received habilitation with the dissertation on separation of powers and constitutional adjudication. He is the author of numerous publications in the field of constitutional law and comparative law. Professor Zing, please take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to this dedicated conference. I have a pretty difficult task today. Well, it is always difficult to keep the attendance in a Friday afternoon panel in a conference. But moreover, my problem is that the case law on religious symbols in Hungary is rather poor. Some of the countries are lucky enough to have interesting cases on displaying crosses, wearing hijab, the admissibility of nativity plays. We are not that lucky. So first of all, I try to share my slides. Here they are. Okay. I hope now you see it. And one just remark before starting my presentation, I'm really technophobe. So what you see is that I'm somewhere out of space and there's a pretty fancy background, which was made by my daughter. And I don't know how to remove it. So sorry about that. So my presentation, first I'd like to have some words on religion and state and church relation in Hungary. Then I will focus on religious symbols and what is the situation of religious symbols in Hungary. As Professor Sanda mentioned in first presentation, Hungary is pretty much divided by religion. Most of the population consider themselves religious, but there's not a great part of the people who really goes to church every Sunday. As you see, most of the people are Roman Catholic, but we have a strong minority of Protestants, mostly Calvinists. So some 35, according to the latest census, 35% consider themselves Roman Catholic and some 15% Calvinist. Because of the religious division, Hungary needed to have treaties and regulations how different religions can live next to each other in peace. So one of the first treaties on freedom of religion was the Torda Peace Treaty in 1568. This was made in Transylvania because in Transylvania there were many Catholics, Calvinists, and Unitarians. The peace treaty declared everyone's freedom of religion. And this was the first political document I know that declared that the faith is the gift of God. So we don't have the right to overrule personal conviction. That time, Hungary was divided also geographically, because North Hungary, named as Kingdom of Hungary, was ruled by Catholic Habsburgs. In Transylvania, it was an independent country, and the rulers of Transylvania were mostly Protestants, while the rest of the country was occupied by the Ottoman Empire. So there was a great Muslim impact all over the country. The religious division remained also in the 20th century, but as in all of our countries, during the communist era, there was anti-religious activities, and this lasted until the political transition of 1989-1990. Hungary didn't opt for a strict separation model. Instead, there was a cooperation between the state and the churches. And most of our constitutional issues, most of Hungarian case law on religion concerned the status of church, the finances of churches, but not the individual freedom of religion. The reason for that is that in 1990, the Church Act, the regulation on churches was very liberal. There was a practically free establishment of churches. So 100 people could decide to establish a church, and they were free to run, and there was no legal distinction between the Catholic Church and a small church of 100 people. But in 2011, the parliament decided to introduce a multi-level church system. The more believers the church had, the longer tradition they had, the upper category they received. And this church system caused many constitutional concerns. So the Constitutional Court had several decisions on the church system, and also the Strasbourg Court had a decision. This was the case of Menonita versus Hungary, and they also had several concerns. Besides all these, the question of religious symbols were practically hidden. You may say that we are a lucky country, that we have no problems with religious symbols, but this is not really the case. The case is much more that symbols cause political issues, and they hardly turn to legal ones. Let me give you some examples. So, for instance, there is a political party who displayed crosses on squares of Budapest, and now Budapest has a socialist mayor, and there were gossips that the mayor was to ban the display of crosses on public places. But this resulted only a political issue, and as far as I know, there was not a legal case on that. I also have knowledge of a case in which a clerk in a court started to wear hijab, and it was a question in the court if this clerk can wear a hijab in a court. But this didn't raise a legal question either. There was a civil law solution of the case. So the judiciary is not in a position to decide on religious symbols in most of the questions. Of course, there are a few exceptions on that. There was a local government who decided to ban hijabs in the territory of the government. But this activity, this ban was legal nonsense. Local governments don't have the competence to restrict individual rights. And the Constitutional Court annulled the local government decree on formal grounds. So the Constitutional Court didn't decide on the admissibility of hijabs in marriage. It is more interesting that there was an ombudsman's opinion on the display and the use of crosses. I will give you the details later on. And the most interesting questions raised early this year, and the key question, if religion can be mocked, so you can put it as blasphemy cases, and the Constitutional Court had two decisions early this year. As for the Ombudsman's opinion, there was a local government who turned to the Ombudsman and asked the statement, the position of the Ombudsman, if crosses and other religious symbols can be displayed either inside of local government buildings or outside, so an area open for public. So there were two questions put. Firstly, does the presence of the cross infringe the separation of church and state? And secondly, if it infringes the freedom of religion of individuals. In his opinion, the Ombudsman divided the questions to two. There must be a distinction made on public use on religious symbols and the private use of them. I mean, public use of a symbol is, according to the Ombudsman, if the local government itself decides as performing public power to display a cross. And private use is when the use of religious symbols is part of privacy. I mean that the employees of the local government wear crosses or put religious symbols to their workrooms or something like that. And the second interesting question, if the symbol is cultural or religious. Professor Schonda also mentioned that it's hard to differentiate. There's not a clear borderline between cultural symbols and religious symbols. So, for instance, the Hungarian coat of arms has the holy crown on the coat of arms, which is the symbol of the state. But it has a religious background, it has religious roots. So it is an important question if the symbol is more cultural or more religious. And the Ombudsman concluded that, first of all, everyone is free to manifest their religion, and either explicitly or through symbols. So placing symbols is part of freedom of religion. But no one can be forced to respect religious symbols. And it is, in this part, the Ombudsman's opinion is very close to the Strasbourg Court's opinion in the Lauzi case. It must be considered if the symbol is active or passive, if it is offensive or not. And the Ombudsman added that public authorities do not have freedom of religion. So when they use a symbol, they cannot say that public power is performed under a religious symbol. So they can use symbols only if the cultural content is obviously greater than the religious one. Now I turn to the blasphemy cases I mentioned. There is a provision of the Civil Code. I'm not about to read the whole text, but the important part is that if I'm a member of a community, including religious communities, and I consider that my community is degraded or otherwise infringed, so as the Civil Code says, there's a serious violation that damages the community's reputation, I, as a member of the community, can turn to court. And there were two cases early this year. There was, now I show you a picture. This is von Honhorst's Adoration of the Shepherds. This is quite a well-known painting. And there is a Hungarian journal that reconsidered the picture, and the outcome is this one. And now you see that there are public figures of Hungarian political elite in the picture instead of Mary and the shepherds. And instead of Jesus, there is a sum of money in the cradle. And the title is, in Hungarian, it's not Karácsony. In our geographical era, Harács might be a well-known word. This is the Turkish word for tax, and during the Ottoman Empire, Harács was the tax they collected. And now we use this word for violent money collecting. So the message of the picture is that Hungarian political elite adore not Jesus, but money. And one of an individual turned to court saying that the picture infringes all Catholics. But the Constitutional Court, finally, the case came to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court concluded that the picture itself doesn't infringe Catholic individuals. It is part of freedom of expression because it is not about to degrade religion, but it instead it is a meme for the religious background of Hungarian political elite. But there was another case which has some Polish connection. There was a demonstration at the Polish embassy because of the Polish abortion rules. And during the demonstration, there was a demonstrator who dressed like a priest and imitated Eucharist while giving abortion pills instead of bread. And this activity was also challenged. And the Court of First Instance rejected the petition, while on the second instance, the Court of Appeal reversed the decision. So they said this action is not admissible because it infringes Catholics. But finally, the Curia decided in favor of freedom of expression, and the Curia concluded that if the Catholic Church has a strong view in abortion, they must accept that this view can be criticized. And finally, the case came to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court concluded that there is a close connection to individual conviction. So unlike the previous picture, it doesn't infringe public figures, but it involves the personal dignity of all Catholics. So finally, the Constitutional Court decided in favor of freedom of religion and said that such an action is not accepted. The interesting question in both cases, if symbols of other religions have the same protection of Christian symbols or not. So is there any difference among religions? Interestingly, the majority opinions of both cases did not mention the constitutional reference to Christian culture, only the individual right to freedom. So I may conclude that the Constitutional Court is about to protect the individuals, protect the believers, and not to rather than protecting a specific culture, which I may say that in Hungary, the drawings like Charlie Hebdo wouldn't be admissible according to the decisions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Zing, for your presentation about religious symbols in Hungary.